Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the role of the United States Congress in dealing with major problems such as climate change, migration, international trade, and terrorism, as well as many others? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to look at previous programs, as well as to perhaps make suggestions for future topics and future guests. Today we're taking a look at a very important organization, institution, the United States Congress, and the role it plays as being a co-equal branch of government in dealing with developing international and domestic policies and legislation. My guest today is an expert on that institution and on these issues. My guest today is Congressman John Yarmuth. Congressman John Yarmuth represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives, which basically includes the majority or most of Louisville, Kentucky, USA. Now in his 5th term, Congressman Yarmuth serves on the Committee on Energy and Commerce and the Committee on Budget, on which he is the 2nd-ranking Democrat. He has been recognized for his work to improve education, expand access to affordable health care, and revitalize manufacturing in Louisville. Congressman John Yarmuth, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start off with the hardest topic that's probably out there. There's more and more scientific data indicating that climate change is real, global warming is happening, and many of the scientists, like 97% of the climate scientists, believe climate change is happening. But the challenge we have is how to deal with this. It's something that can destabilize the whole world to a large degree. Are there any initiatives now in the United States Congress that, being a co-equal branch of government with the executive branch, with the judicial branch, and then the Congress with the House of Representatives and the Senate, are there initiatives to confront climate change and to deal with this and hopefully slow it down or even reverse it if possible?
Well, sadly, Bill, the momentum, if there is any, is in exactly the opposite direction. Unfortunately, from my perspective, we have a Congress where both houses are controlled by Republicans. Republicans, while a lot of them do believe that there is a changing climate, contest if they do believe that. They don't believe that, or not convinced that human activity has caused it. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of Republicans who don't believe that there is climate change. They say, oh, the climate's always changing. So right now what we have is attempts actually to roll back a lot of our environmental protections to fight the EPA on its efforts to reduce carbon emissions and toxic emissions. So right now, again, the trend, unfortunately, is in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm. And the public, the general public, the latest poll I saw showed like 69% of the public believes climate change is happening. There are some folks who are climate change deniers. Some think that's just a natural phenomenon. But there's a tremendous discrepancy between the climate change deniers and the general public. It seems like that. What is contributing to that? Is it fossil fuel money going into campaigns? Is it the putting out misinformation that you so often hear from groups like the Heartland Institute, from the American Legislative Exchange Council, Fox News to some degree, groups like that?
Yes, a lot of conservative media, Fox included, take the position that the way they discuss climate change is bring one scientist on it who disagrees with the vast majority of scientists, as you mentioned, and then if they have another voice on, they only have one and say, see, the opinions are mixed, acting as if there's a balance of opinions on either side, which of course there isn't. But you have now the Secretary of Defense just this year saying that climate change is a national security threat. You now have the Pope on record as believing it, and he is a scientist. And it's kind of, when you take the totality of opinions and certainly public attitudes about climate change, there's no question that the vast majority of the world understands the climate is changing, that there are dire repercussions of this if we don't start acting now. And the president, to his credit, has used whatever executive authority he has to try and deal with it. And it's also, of course, gotten China to agree to participate in activities and setting goals to reduce carbon emissions over the next couple decades. So that's really important work. And again, we've got to stop the Congress the Republican Congress from undoing what the president's trying to do.
And as you mentioned, the Pope has weighed in. He weighed in solidly in support of climate change scientists.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it. He came right on board, and he will have a tremendous impact, I think, not only with Catholics, but also with many other people around the world, and the United States and around the world, do you think?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And it's not just because he took a moral approach to climate change and the fact that, that God expects mankind to protect the resources that God has given, if you believe that. But I think it's the fact that he did something that no pope has ever done before, to take on something like this, which is, it's clearly they've taken on abortion as an issue, but this was unexpected. It was unequivocal. He used some very vivid language describing the state of the world right now. So I think the fact that he did this, I think took this unusual step, will have some impact.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you're from Kentucky. There's coal production. Kentucky, I think, is the third largest coal producer in the country. And coal production it may be going up, but the miners' jobs are going down because of automation, because of a move to gas, which is cleaner and cheaper. Yeah. But what can be done? Eventually, coal is going to be phased out. There's no doubt about it. There may be a little bit of production, but not much. But what can be done to help coal miners who are going to lose their jobs to make sure that they have an economic livelihood in the future?
Well, I think there is an opportunity for the federal government to help in this regard with job training and re-education. I know, for instance, that a lot of the people now, according to people I know in the community college system, a lot of the people going to community colleges now are people in their 40s and 50s whose jobs have become obsolete and they're going back to get a new skill. The governor's SOAR, it's called, I'm sorry, we're not necessarily a state audience. Governor Beshear has created what's called the SOAR initiative, and that's Save Our Appalachian Region, to try to figure out with all the stakeholders in Appalachia what we can do to transition from coal to a more diverse economy. It's a critical thing we do, but as you mentioned, there's so few coal miners left in Eastern Kentucky. We were at one point. There were 50, 60,000 coal miners in Eastern Kentucky. Now there are like 7,000. So there are not that many people who need to be retrained. So it might be something about just a situation in which we just support those people and then train the next generation.
Sure. And also, a lot of states are recruiting solar panel plants and different things like that to come into their area to create employment, not only clean employment, where you don't get black lung, which coal miners do, but also in many cases pay more than what coal miners are earning. But the climate change is a major, major problem. And even if people don't want to believe that it's actually humans that are contributing to it, all they need to do, I think, is look at a map of a glacier from 1930 to 1950 to today, and that thing is probably about a third of the size it was. And we see that these glaciers are disappearing, they're melting, the seas are rising, desertification is taking place, and we need to do something about it, and we need to get on board as soon as possible to do this. So, but
now nations are battling over the seaway rights to the Arctic Ocean because it's going to be passable virtually year-round.
Exactly, right, exactly. And our own Defense Department, I think you mentioned earlier, has put out a study saying climate change could be one of the most dysfunctional events that could take place, can create more chaos than just about anything in the
Clearly.
future. You're going to have people going to war over water rights. They're already doing that. It's not a matter of they're going to. They're in the process in many areas. But let's go to another hot spot.
right.
The Middle East, we see how it is destabilized. It's the Middle East, to put it mildly, is a mess. Is there a magic bullet? Is there something that we could do that we're not doing now without, I know Americans do not want to put boots on the ground, that type of thing, but is there something we could do to help bring stability to Iraq, to perhaps Syria, which seems to be a lost cause, Libya to some degree, but are there other things we could do that or perhaps we're not doing yet?
Just a few weeks ago, I attended an Aspen Institute program in Montreal focusing on the Middle East, and we had sessions on each of these situations: Libya, Iraq, Egypt, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, Iran, ISIS, and we had experts from around the world and people who had been engaged in these efforts. And virtually every one of them said the same thing, and that is there's no silver bullet for this. There is no quick fix for this. This is a long-term battle. And of course, President Obama has mentioned that as well, that this is a long fight. There are things we can do, I think, that utilize kind of the humanitarian services to, most of these people who join these terrorist organizations like ISIS are young men who have no hope of any other kind of sustenance. And so they're promised money, they're promised women, they're promised a gun and something to do, and they don't, because they don't have an alternative. And so I don't think it can be United States can't do this by itself. These are going to have to be a coalition of willing partners, including all of the nations in that part of the world, who make a commitment to try and help each other create stability. And I think even the Iranians, what they say when they're asked about how they support President Assad in Syria is, right now that's the only source of stability, and they're trying to create stability. They say that, whether it's true or not. But I think everybody's looking for that. But it's going to take. And I think, if we can get this Iran nuclear deal done, I think there's an opportunity to engage with Iran as a country with resources and with an interest in stability in the region to help us create stability, as does Saudi Arabia, as does Egypt. I met in 2011 with the Egyptian military right after the coup. So they were in charge then, now they're in charge again. And basically what they said was, they're in charge because they're the only ones who can create stability. Now, I think a lot of us would have a problem with the way they're doing it and a lot of the tactics they use, but everyone is interested in stability right now, because without stability, you don't have any economic activity, which means your people suffer, and no power structure is safe then.
Exactly, that's very, very true. And that's a good segue right into the Iranian issue, which is very, very important. And of course, we see that, the United Nations is really the U.S.'s and the world's, a large number of the countries in the world's number one partner in combating terrorism. There are UN sanctions against Iran right now. You've got the negotiations going on with the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the U.S., Russia, China, the U.K., and France, along with Germany in there. And the idea is to move these forward. But this is really a major issue that has to come to a logical conclusion. By logical, I don't mean going to war. That is not a logical conclusion. But it has to. They have to reach some agreement, do they not?
I think so. I think both sides recognize that. I've been briefed probably 7 or 8 times by the White House on the state of the negotiations over the last 7, 8 months. And I feel like I have a pretty good sense of the dynamics of those talks. And I'm one who believes that the deal that was outlined, the agreement outlined in Switzerland in April, is a very, very attractive deal, and is something that it beats any alternative. And that's what, the president's asked that too. Many people have said, what is the alternative? And the simplistic answer that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave is a better deal. Well, that is probably insultingly simplistic. And it's also, in a way, I think, a reflection of the fact that there is no good alternative. If there were a really good alternative, he would have mentioned that. Right now, the only alternative, if you want to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, the only alternative to this deal is to bomb their facilities. And that is not even a viable alternative, because all that would do, first of all, it would push them away. They would be on the defensive. They would move even more quickly toward trying to get a nuclear weapon. If in fact they are now, there's really no evidence that they are now. And we would have stopped them, we would have delayed them for maybe a year or two. So this is really important. I know our negotiators feel that there are enough safeguards in this agreement, assuming that the agreement announced in April is what can actually be put on paper. The Iranians seem to be backing away, at least rhetorically, on a few of the points. But again, that may be just posturing for their internal audiences. I think that's probably what it is. But again, I don't think there is an alternative to this negotiation. And remember, the Iranians and the United States have been basically not talking since the late 70s. And there's a lot of distrust that's built up on both sides, and probably with good reason on both sides.
Exactly, and that's very, very true. Well, we're talking about international issues. Well, the issues we're talking about today, we're talking about Kentucky and the United States as a microcosm, but these apply to people all around the world. We talk about climate change. Coal miners in Poland are going to be affected by this. Coal miners in China. The Iranian situation will impact the entire world. So what we're talking about today will certainly reverberate. Well, let's focus a little bit domestically for a moment. The Affordable Care Act, the ACA, came online several years ago. And it basically is going to, as I understand it, going to bring the uninsured into it. Now, the United States is probably the last industrialized country to come up with sort of a national health care act. What is the Affordable Care Act? What is it supposed to do? And what are the advantages and maybe some of the disadvantages of it?
Okay, well, first of all, the United States is the only country in the industrialized world that does not have a government organized healthcare system. And it is also the only system in the industrialized world that retains employer-based insurance. So the vast majority of people who have private insurance in this country have it through their job. Their employer provides it. They may pay a little bit, but their employer is providing it. Again, we're the only country that does that. And it's not because we're smarter than everybody else. It's because of an aberration after World War II where there were wage and price controls put on businesses. They couldn't raise people's salaries. So the way they kept their best employees was to give them health insurance. So what the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, attempts to do is to take the existing structure, our combination of private insurance, employer-based insurance, Medicare and Medicaid, two government programs one for the disabled and young and the disabled and senior citizens, and one for low-income citizens, and build a system that keeps those systems in place, but makes access to insurance available and affordable for everyone. So for people who are over a certain income level, they can buy insurance now in a competitive marketplace and get subsidies from the government to help them afford the premiums. And then those who are below a certain income level, but we expand that coverage, can get it essentially free from their state government, with the federal government helping to pay. I'm one of those who would much prefer to see essentially Medicare for everyone, a government system where everyone's covered under the same plan. But I think this plan, which actually was initially a Republican concept that was developed in Massachusetts and implemented there, that's what the administration thought was doable. So this was a politically feasible way to at least make insurance available to everyone.
Exactly. As I recall, I think the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, came up with this idea several years ago and was promoting it.
And the whole idea was it's based on individual accountability. That's why it fit into conservative philosophy, because everyone has to have insurance under this bill, and you're penalized if you don't have it. So if your employer doesn't provide it, or you're not working and you're not eligible for one of the other government programs, you have to go in and buy insurance. That's individual accountability. The thought being that if you get injured or sick and you don't have insurance, the people who do have insurance are going to pay for you because you're going to go to the hospital. You're going to get cared for in most cases, and we'll end up paying the hospital for that care.
And that's a challenge. A serious illness could wipe out a family forever. They could be in debt for the rest of their lives, or an individual. And if they go to the emergency room, it costs even more to do it than if you actually got regular treatment or went in for some type of early diagnosis or something like
Sure.
that. So,
and one of the problems we have in terms of public understanding of the ACA and what it does is that fortunately most people have not had an experience where they got cancer or Alzheimer's or a serious injury, debilitating injury, where they're going to be experiencing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of bills. And the Affordable Care Act prohibits that. I mean, there are no lifetime limits on benefits and no annual limits on benefits. But if you haven't had that threat, then you don't understand how important the Affordable Care Act is. It's protecting people from bankruptcy and saving many lives.
Exactly. Now, if we could jump back internationally again for
Sure.
a moment. We were talking about the UN earlier, and the UN provides a panoply of services. We've seen Rotarians have teamed up with the UN World Health Organization, UNICEF, to eliminate polio from the scourge of the earth. Kiwanians work with UNICEF on iodine deficiency disorder programs. The UN provides a panoply of services. You live in Louisville. UPS, United Parcel Service, has one of their largest hubs in the world. A UN agency helps move those jets every night around the world. We never hear about these services, but one we do hear about is peacekeeping. And there are 16 peacekeeping missions right now with troops on loan from other countries to the United Nations to maintain peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, what have you. Our Defense Department supports peacekeeping. The American public supports peacekeeping. It's fairly shared. The peacekeeping budget's our share is only $2.4 billion, which is not much in the grand scheme of things.
No.
And it's eight times cheaper to use UN peacekeepers than to use American troops. And the American public does not want American troops in harm's way. The polls show that. But again, going back to the inconsistency in Congress, sometimes you hear a lot of the members of Congress say, well, we don't want to fund UN peacekeeping. It's not in our best interest. But that simply is not the case, is it?
No, but I think exactly it's not the case. But I think what you have here is it's the mentality that it's the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. The United States ought to get to call the shots. United States' vote should not be the same as Burundi's vote, and yet we're paying the balance of the expenses of the United Nations. Well, we're obligated to. We're not always paying it. But again, I think this is part of this is American exceptionalism, which is very dangerous in a lot of ways. I mean, America is an exceptional nation and a very powerful nation, but we are in a global society right now, a global economy, and we ought to be trying to make the United Nations work as well as possible, trying to be as respectful of all the other nations in it as we can be. And I think politically, it's easy to bash the United Nations kind of if you're one of those who, again, is an American exceptionalist. And it's unfortunate because if the United Nations weren't there, we would have to invent something just like it. Again, what is the alternative to that? And you mentioned the peacekeeping missions. The alternative is that we go and do it ourselves, which, first of all, we're not prepared to do financially or psychologically.
Exactly. And as Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, said, the UN is not perfect, but it is indispensable. We have to have it. There is no other option. And who's going to help move UPS and Delta and American Airlines jets around the world, Lufthansa and all of those? And we would have to go in to do it and be much more expensive, and it's just not in our best interest.
Absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, I have lots of more topics to deal with, but we're running out of time. In the last 30, 40 seconds we have left, what has been the most gratifying experience that you've had as being a member of Congress, being one of really a unique body, 435 members of the House of Representatives? Is there one that comes to mind immediately?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm like many who were there when the Affordable Care Act passed and believe it's the most important piece of legislation, and at least in the last 50 years, and to have been a part of that was very rewarding. But on a day-to-day basis, it's actually just talking to my constituents and making sure they feel they have a connection to their government. It means a lot to them, and it's very, very important and gratifying part of this job.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, information is so important. It's very important that constituents learn more about what the members of Congress are doing, follow the issues, express their concerns. Same thing with the United Nations. The polls show that the American public generally supports the UN, but we do not understand the UN at all as to how the UN helps move mail, weather information, jets, ships around the world, and those types of things. But Congressman John Yarmuth from the 3rd Congressional District in Kentucky, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Enjoyed it, Bill. Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
me.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.